The sound of a knock at the door wasn't unusual, until I opened it to see my neighbor, drenched from the storm, with an offer to fix my Wi-Fi. What should have been a simple favor turned into an evening I'll never forget. As thunder roared outside, the tension between us grew inside, and by the end of the night, my life was tangled in more than just the router's cables. It was just another busy Tuesday evening. I had been juggling back-to-back virtual meetings, deadlines piling up faster than I could manage, and by the time the clock struck 7 p.m., exhaustion had settled in. The warm glow of my laptop screen and the rhythmic sound of typing were my only companions as I worked tirelessly to complete a client project. My apartment was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the air conditioner, and the storm clouds gathering outside painted the room in an eerie grey light. Despite the chaos of my schedule, I prided myself on maintaining order, both in my work and in my life. At least, that was the facade I presented to the world. The truth was, beneath the veneer of productivity, there was an emptiness I couldn't quite shake. My social life had taken a backseat to my career, and though I had plenty of acquaintances, true connections felt rare and fleeting. Enter Theo, my neighbor. He'd moved into the apartment next door a few months ago, and while our exchanges had been brief, a friendly wave in the hallway, a polite smile at the mailbox, there was something about him that always lingered in my mind. Tall, effortlessly charming, and with a quiet confidence that made him impossible to ignore, Theo had a presence that seemed to fill a room without him even trying. I didn't know much about him beyond the surface-level pleasantries we'd shared. He seemed laid back, easygoing, and capable in a way that made me wonder what it would be like to truly know him. But I never dared to find out, chalking up my curiosity to simple neighborly intrigue. That evening, when my Wi-Fi failed just as I was about to submit a crucial project, my stress levels skyrocketed. Frustration bubbled up as I stared at the blinking red light on the router, my mind racing through a dozen unworkable solutions. And then, as if on cue, I remembered Theo. Something about him seemed reliable, someone who could fix more than just technical issues. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my sweater and stepped into the hallway. Little did I know, knocking on his door would set into motion a series of events that would completely alter the course of my otherwise predictable life. As Theo stood in my living room, tools in hand, effortlessly working on the router, I couldn't help but notice how natural he looked in my space. His steady movements and calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm raging outside and the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. Was I overthinking? Probably. But there was something undeniable in the air, a tension that lingered just below the surface. We chatted casually while he worked, his deep, soothing voice breaking the silence. He told me about his day, his knack for fixing things, and even joked about the freelancer lifestyle as he adjusted the cables with precision. I laughed along, though my mind was elsewhere. His easy smile and warm presence felt disarming, and I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't expected. But then, the little moments started to stand out. The way his hand brushed mine when he handed me the screwdriver I didn't even need, the way his eyes lingered on mine a fraction longer than necessary, and the subtle curve of his lips when he caught me staring. My breath hitched when our hands accidentally touched as we reached for the same cable. It was nothing, I told myself. Nothing at all. Or was it? I tried to focus on the task at hand. Well, his task. He was the one fixing the Wi-Fi, not me. Still, my mind raced with questions I couldn't quite answer. Why did he seem so at ease here, like he belonged? Why did I care so much about what he thought of me, my messy stack of books, or the unwashed mug on the counter? When Theo finally announced the router was back online, I felt a strange pang of disappointment. It wasn't about the Wi-Fi anymore, and I knew it. All set, he said with a grin, brushing his hands off as he stood. Relief flooded me, but so did something else, an inexplicable longing to keep him here just a little longer. On impulse, I offered him coffee. It's the least I can do for saving me from certain disaster, I said with a smile. To my surprise, he hesitated, then nodded. I wouldn't say no to a good cup of coffee. As I moved to the kitchen, I felt a nervous energy building. My hands shook slightly as I poured the mugs, and I cursed myself for how obvious it felt. When I handed Theo his cup, our fingers brushed again, and this time I didn't pull away as quickly as I should have. His eyes flickered to mine, a quiet intensity in his gaze that made my pulse quicken. We sat down and talked, really talked, about our work, our routines, the quirks of this old apartment building. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background as the conversation flowed effortlessly, but beneath it all, I could feel an undercurrent of something unspoken. Then it happened again, a fleeting look, a subtle shift in the air between us. When Theo reached to adjust his cup, his hand rested a little too close to mine on the table, and neither of us moved away. My chest tightened as I realized I was holding my breath. He finally broke the silence, his voice softer now. You know, I've lived here for months, and this is the first time we've really talked like this. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without revealing too much. He smiled, that easy, disarming smile, but there was something deeper in his expression, something that made me feel exposed and vulnerable in the best and worst ways. As the storm outside continued to rage, so did the quiet storm within me. Was it just harmless tension between neighbors, or was this the beginning of something I wasn't ready to admit? The storm outside intensified, its howling winds and distant thunder setting an almost cinematic backdrop to the moment between us. Theo leaned back against the couch, his arm casually draped along the backrest, but his posture betrayed a tension I could feel in the air. I tried to act casual, sipping my coffee, but my hands trembled ever so slightly. Every time I glanced at him, I caught his eyes lingering on me, and I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that he wasn't looking away or the fact that I didn't want him to. The silence stretched, charged with an unspoken energy. I fidgeted with my mug, trying to break the tension with idle chatter. Do storms like this make you nostalgic? I asked, my voice shakier than I intended. Theo chuckled softly, the sound sending a warm ripple through the room. Maybe, he said, his tone low and thoughtful. Or maybe they just make me realize how nice it is to have company during one. I looked up at him, startled by the weight of his words. His gaze held mine, steady and searching, and for a moment, the storm outside felt miles away. The air between us felt heavier, almost tangible, as if crossing an invisible line was inevitable. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I possibly say? Theo leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and the movement closed the distance between us. I've been thinking, he began, his voice quieter now. Why haven't we done this before? Talked like this, I mean. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. I don't know, I admitted softly. Maybe we were just waiting for the right moment. And this feels like it, he asked, his tone laced with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something deeper. I nodded, unable to form the words that matched the emotions flooding through me. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual easy grin. This one was softer, more vulnerable, and it made my chest tighten in ways I didn't expect. Then he shifted closer. It wasn't dramatic, just a small movement that brought him within arm's reach. My pulse quickened as I became hyper-aware of how little space separated us now. His hand rested near mine on the couch, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt shoot through me. This time, neither of us moved away. Theo, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What are we doing? His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might pull back. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low and steady. I don't know, he said honestly, but I don't want to stop. My breath hitched, and the world seemed to fall away. His hand slid closer, his fingers intertwining with mine, and the warmth of his touch was almost too much to bear. My heart raced as he leaned in further, his face mere inches from mine. Is this okay? He asked softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that made me feel seen, understood. I nodded, unable to speak. My lips parted, and in the next heartbeat, his lips brushed against mine. It was tentative at first, as though testing the waters, but when I didn't pull away, it deepened. His hand cupped my face, the warmth of his palm grounding me even as my thoughts spiraled into chaos. The kiss was unlike anything I had experienced before, slow, deliberate, and filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. My hands moved instinctively, settling on his shoulders as I leaned into him, the space between us disappearing entirely. The storm outside seemed to mirror the emotions swirling within me, wild and unrelenting. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested against each other, and I couldn't help but smile. That felt inevitable, I admitted, my voice shaky but sincere. Theo chuckled softly, his breath warm against my skin. Yeah, he said, his tone laced with both relief and disbelief. I think it was. The moment lingered, and neither of us seemed ready to break the spell. His hands settled on my waist, his thumbs brushing gently against my sides, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the coffee or the storm. But then, reality began to creep in. Questions I didn't want to answer started to surface, questions about what this meant, about the lines we were crossing, about the consequences we couldn't avoid. Still, as I looked into Theo's eyes, I couldn't bring myself to care. Not in this moment. We probably shouldn't, I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Probably, he agreed, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. But does that mean we won't? I shook my head, smiling despite myself. No, it doesn't. His smile widened, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The storm raged on outside, but inside, we were lost in something we both knew we couldn't ignore. The door clicked shut behind Jack, but the silence it left was anything but peaceful. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the storm raging outside had somehow moved into the apartment. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the coffee table, the remnants of my conversation with Theo scattered across it, a half-empty mug, a misplaced screwdriver, and the lingering heat of his presence. My thoughts raced, colliding with one another in a chaotic loop. Jack's words echoed in my head, "I've always trusted you. But right now, I'm not sure I should." His doubt was warranted, I knew that, but hearing it aloud was like a knife twisting in my chest. How had it come to this? A simple favor, a neighborly gesture, had unraveled my carefully constructed life in a matter of hours. I got up and started pacing, my steps quick and uneven as I replayed every moment of the evening. Theo's soft smile, his hand brushing mine, the way his lips had felt against mine, all of it came rushing back in vivid detail. And then there was Jack, standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from concern to suspicion to hurt. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over Theo's number. I wanted to call him, to hear his voice, to reassure myself that what had happened wasn't entirely in my head. But what would I even say? That I was unraveling, that I didn't know how to piece everything back together. My thumb hesitated over the screen before I set the phone down with a frustrated sigh. The next day brought no relief. Jack hadn't called or texted, and I couldn't bring myself to reach out either. Instead, I threw myself into work, hoping the distraction would numb the gnawing guilt. But every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, only to sink when it wasn't him, or worse, when it was. Theo texted once, "Hope everything's okay. Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity before replying with a curt, "Thanks, I'm fine." It was a lie, of course. I wasn't fine. I was far from it. Jack showed up unannounced later that evening. The storm had passed, leaving the air cool and still, but the tension between us was palpable. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He moved to the couch but didn't sit, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. Or someone. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice carefully measured. "And I need to ask, was there something going on between you and him?" The question hit me like a freight train. I opened my mouth, scrambling for a response, but the truth hovered dangerously close to the surface. "Jack, nothing happened," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "He's just a neighbor. He was helping me with the Wi-Fi, and we had coffee. That's all." Jack's eyes met mine, and I saw the doubt still lingering there. "Are you sure? Because the way you looked at him when I walked in, it didn't feel like nothing." I swallowed hard, guilt twisting in my gut. "You have to believe me," I said, my voice trembling. "It wasn't what you think." He nodded slowly, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he sat down, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if I can," he admitted quietly. "Not right now." His words shattered something inside me, but I couldn't blame him. I had crossed a line, maybe not in a way he could see, but in a way that mattered. The emotional betrayal was undeniable, even if I hadn't let it go further than a kiss. The days that followed were agonizing. Jack pulled away, his texts short and infrequent, his visits non-existent. The distance between us grew, and I found myself falling deeper into the tangled web I'd woven. Theo, too, seemed to sense the shift, his messages becoming sparse, his usual easy smile replaced with a quiet tension whenever I saw him in passing. One evening, as I sat alone in the dimly lit apartment, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Jack. "We need to talk." When he arrived, he looked exhausted, the weight of our situation etched into every line of his face. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I care about you, but I can't shake the feeling that something's changed. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but I don't think I trust us anymore." His words left me breathless. "Jack, please," I said, my voice breaking. "I made a mistake, but it doesn't mean I don't love you." He sighed, his gaze softening. "I know you do. But love isn't enough if the trust isn't there." And just like that, it was over. Jack left, and the weight of his absence settled into the apartment like a thick fog. I curled up on the couch, tears streaming down my face as I replayed every moment that had led me here. The fallout wasn't just about losing Jack. It was about losing myself, the person I thought I was. Theo had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through, and now, I was left standing on the threshold, unsure of what lay on the other side. In the days that followed Jack's departure, the silence in my apartment became a constant reminder of everything I had lost. The laughter, the easy conversations, and the stability that once anchored my life were gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt and regret. I spent hours staring at my phone, torn between reaching out to him and accepting that I had destroyed something precious. Theo, too, faded into the background. Our stolen moments now felt like echoes of a life I wasn't ready for, a life that came with its own weight of consequences. I saw him in passing a few times, his expression a mix of concern and restraint, but neither of us said much. The connection we'd shared, intense and consuming, now felt too fragile to confront. It wasn't until one quiet evening, when the rain returned in a gentle drizzle, that I allowed myself to reflect on everything with a clearer mind. Sitting by the window, a cup of tea in my hands, I replayed the events of that fateful night, the choices I made, the emotions I couldn't control, and the lines I'd crossed without fully understanding the consequences. What struck me most was the realization that it wasn't just about Jack or Theo. It was about me, about the parts of myself I had ignored for too long. The loneliness I had buried beneath work, the longing for connection I refused to acknowledge, and the vulnerability I had been too afraid to face. Theo's presence had illuminated something I didn't want to see, the cracks in my carefully curated life. But awareness, as painful as it was, came with a sense of clarity. I couldn't undo the past, but I could choose how to move forward. And moving forward meant being honest, with myself, with Jack, and even with Theo. The first step was reaching out to Jack. I sent him a long message, apologizing not just for the mistakes I had made but for the distance I had allowed to grow between us long before Theo entered the picture. I told him I understood if he couldn't forgive me, but I needed him to know that my actions had nothing to do with a lack of love and everything to do with my own unresolved issues. His reply came hours later, short but sincere. "I need time, but thank you for saying this. Take care of yourself." It wasn't the reconciliation I had hoped for, but it was a start, a step toward healing, even if it was on separate paths. As for Theo, I decided to confront what had happened between us. One evening, I knocked on his door, my heart racing as I waited for him to answer. When he opened it, his surprise quickly gave way to understanding. "I owe you an explanation," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind inside me. Theo gestured for me to come in, and we sat down in his living room, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. I told him everything, how I had let my loneliness cloud my judgment, how I had used him as a distraction from my own fears, and how much I regretted the way things had played out. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "I get it," he said softly. "We were both looking for something that night, but maybe it wasn't the right time." His words were gentle but truthful, and I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. We didn't need to label what we had or dwell on the what ifs. What mattered was that we both understood it for what it was, a fleeting moment that had forced us to confront parts of ourselves we might otherwise have ignored. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. I focused on my work, not as a way to escape but as a way to rediscover my passion. I reconnected with friends I had distanced myself from, finding solace in their support and laughter. And most importantly, I started to forgive myself, not all at once, but piece by piece, learning to accept that mistakes didn't define me. The rain still falls sometimes, and when it does, I think of that night, not with regret, but with gratitude for the lessons it taught me. It showed me the cracks in my foundation, but it also gave me the tools to rebuild. And while I may not know what the future holds, I know one thing for certain: I'll never stop striving to be the best version of myself, for me and for the people I care about. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Could you forgive, or would the betrayal be too much? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping, real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything. And stay tuned, next week's story might just make you rethink the boundaries of trust all over again.